Welcome back to the Birds of a Feather Talk Together podcast. We've got a shorter episode this week as we answer a few of our listener mailbag questions. We'll be off next week for the 4th of July, and then we'll return the following week with some brand new episodes. We're pumped about our upcoming episodes. We'll do one on the purple martin, one on the great horned owl, which will be our first full episode on an owl. We'll also have an episode on a common bird that many of you see every day, the cardinal. We'll cover a number of topics, including some cool things that you probably didn't know about cardinals. We're also discussing the super interesting oil bird. Oil birds are nocturnal and live in caves in South America. Similar to bats, they use echolocation to navigate throughout the air. These aren't the only similarities with bats, so make sure to listen to hear more. As I mentioned earlier, we'll be down next week for the 4th of July. If you're looking to hear more from us, though, John was featured on an episode of Ologies with Allie Ward. We'll post a link to that episode in our Instagram next week. Make sure to check it out. Okay, now let's get into these listener mailbag questions. So this one is from Ann and Jim in Sanibel Island, Florida. They said, "We have red knots that travel through Sanibel every year on their migration. They have such a long migration, so it's always exciting to see them. Do they always return to the same spot each year on their migration path? If they stop in Sanibel one year, will the same bird typically come back to Sanibel the following year?"
So the quick answer there is sort of, and probably yes, if if things go the way, migration is such a tough thing in the sense of weather conditions can dictate various things. But I think the quick answer is once they find places, that's one of the reasons why staging areas are so important. So for instance, on the East Coast, north of there, knot migration and some of the other species are tied to the horseshoe crabs breeding. And so there's a ton of food and, so there are reasons why they stop in these places. And once they find good places, they'll come back to them. I mean, it makes sense for birds that are moving that far to find landmarks. Now they may screw up sometimes and not make it, but no, they definitely will.
I mean, their populations again are declining because of horseshoe crab populations. There not being enough of them for them, so their populations are declining as well. So you're not going to pass up when migration is such an energetically costly thing. You're not going to pass up a place where in the past you've been able to restock in that. I mean, it's incredible migration when you think of it, right?
Mm-hmm. So where do the knots travel from then? I mean, the red knots have one of the longest migration patterns. Is that correct?
Yeah, they're going down to southern South America and breeding up in the Arctic. Wow. But I was going to give another example within individuals where we just happen to know something, which is Monty and Rose, these two piping plovers that were breeding together at Montrose. Well, that's a small enough population bird that people know where they winter, and Monty and Rose wintered in different places, but they went back to those different places year after year.
Oh, wow.
So, those are really interesting things that you can begin to learn once you have the capacity to follow these birds, or in the case of some species that the population is small enough that you can actually hope to figure out where individuals might be on the breeding grounds versus the wintering grounds.
I think technology will let us know a lot more about these birds and how they move, because we'll get trackers that can be put on them that, can beam their location that are small enough that even small birds can be monitored. And I think that's really critically important for understanding movements and for charting differences. So if we're going to change the landscape and warm the place up, what does that do to the way birds move? And the only way to know that is to be able to track them.
Mm-hmm. And that's true. And yet at the same time, I always try to emphasize the fact that sample size is really important. And so one of the values of putting a bunch of bird bands on birds in situations where you may not even see them again is that eventually you can get a lot of data because you put a lot of bands on things. And so the tracking...
What if the bands have trackers in them someday?
Well, then we'll get a lot of data. There's no doubt about it. No, it's true.
Yeah.
It's true. The technology is amazing with respect to
This is the one place where I'm glass half full person, and John is not as much of a.
I just think we want to be careful about what one individual bird does relative to the
right.
whole
But if we could ban 50 or 100,
yeah, absolutely,
that's completely different,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
And that if the trackers are small enough, then that's more and inexpensive enough, then that's feasible.
Yeah.
If they can beam to satellites in the sky and not have to use radio towers that you have to put up every 20 kilometers.
Yeah.
But
how close are we from having that become a reality?
We're not very.
Well, so I think that's another glass is half full thing, because the truth of the matter is we didn't have these kinds of things 10 years, 15 years ago. So where's it going to be in 10 or 15 years? Well, I think obviously there are physical limits associated with batteries and things in terms of how small you can get, but at the same
little
time,
solar panels on them.
I think what's been possible just over the last several decades is almost unimaginable in terms of what people can do in terms of getting data on bird movements this way.
It's really fun if there are places online where you could just do a Google search and you can see birds that have been tracked, and you can see the map of where they go while their tracking devices are on them, and it's really fun to look at those maps.
Yeah.
Wow, cool.
And then Shannon, what you just said reminded me. I wanted to ask John, with Monty and Rose, were they a couple?
Mm-hmm.
So they wintered at different places.
They did, yeah. So they met up in Wisconsin, I think is the hypothesis, and then ended up moving down to Chicago and setting up shop in Montrose. And I don't know. I mean, again, that's a whole nother aspect of biology that you can start looking into when you have trackers on things. Is those kinds of questions where, for instance, with red knots, I have no idea whether pairs move together or not.
Or not. Nice.
Sorry about that.
It was a good one. I liked it.
It took me a while to get it.
I'm big into puns. So.
Yeah, you got it right away.
RJ's a dad joke master.
Yeah.
Oh, no.
Yeah. All right. So here's another question. This is from Rob from Indianapolis. He says the collection of bird specimen at the Field Museum is so interesting. Are there any birds in particular that you are hoping to add to the collection? What would be your unicorn to add to the collection?
Oh, man. Well, there's so many ways in which we can continue to make the collection more valuable. I mean, my favorite example is this work we just did in Bermuda, where we wanted to get modern specimens of European goldfinches for Bermuda because we can get genomic data for Louise Bott, our graduate student, to look at all these different questions. And we were able to get permission from the Bermuda government in collaboration with folks there that allowed us to do that. And gosh, there's just so much that goes into that these days that any little thing like that to me is just really important for the collection, and really important not just for the collection itself. That's the other thing is I always like to emphasize that the Field Museum is part of a network of collections across the country and across the world, and one of the things that we need to do is continue to support the network of networks that's out there in terms of making regional collections as important as collections at the Field Museum, in part because they are. So I think
every bird's a unicorn. Actually, just like everybody in this room is different, every human is different, every bird is different. And so each one tells part of the story of its species. And I think that's how I like to look at it. And as far as unicorns go, in the sense that it's meaned in that, I think we always go into the field with a knowledge of what we have and what we don't have. Mm-hmm. And we always come back from field trips and we unpack things, because there's a big party when we unpack things. It's a lot of fun to look at that and speculate on what things are. And sometimes you go in the field and you have things you didn't know that were different, or you knew they were different, but you don't have enough tools to figure out what they are until you have a comparative material that comes from a collection. So you can't think that something is just mundane or not important, because you just never know. But having collections and series of them across geography and through time is what helps us tell the story of a changing Earth, and we need to be invested in things like that. Yeah. Birds are often used as indicators of environmental health, and they can only tell those stories and be contributing if there are specimens that are in museums for people to look at, not pictures, not just site records. All those things are important, but there have to be actual specimens documenting what's there. So only through those specimens we'll know about changing genetics through time, things like that. Yeah. Need the specimens in museums, network database so that they can contribute to science all over the place. I mean, most of our birds were put in our collections before we knew what the structure of DNA was. Nobody knew that, we were going to snip little toe pads of a extinct Carolina parakeet and sample their whole genome. But that's what we do now. So, and we don't know what the next revolution is. Yeah. Birds see in ultraviolet light. We wouldn't know that without all these specimens and with the technology that lets us put a spectrophotometer on and see that birds not only see in ultraviolet light, but they have ultraviolet patches. So you don't know what you don't know. But I do know that the specimens will be part of what happens into the future.
Can I ask John one question?
For sure.
So I just want to know, just getting down to the nitty gritty, when you were talking about the Bermuda trip, is it red tape to actually shoot a bird that is difficult
birds,
to collect?
Or even to collect blood samples.
Okay.
You have to. Yeah, we have to adhere by all kinds of.
It's a lot easier with introduced birds.
People are a little less worried about European goldfinches and house sparrows and starlings, but we go through and it's a big part of what we do these days, and there are national laws, there are international laws, and we follow all those rules and regulations and stay up on the changes that happen to them. And then, there's this big issue or question legitimately about, what's coming back to the country that you're working in. And so, that's another aspect of everything we do, is we want to try to build relationships that are based on mutual benefit. And that's becoming an international requirement under these international agreements like the Nagoya protocols and things. And from my perspective, that's the best thing for birds. Coming back to this idea of a network of networks, I would love to see there be more people in every country in the world who have the capacity to go out and study and monitor and protect birds over time, which includes building collections to help monitor how these, as Shannon was saying, these changes are happening. And so, so it's every place is a little different, and it's all about interacting with the expertise that is in a given country and following the rules and building partnerships. I mean, that's actually fun, in my opinion. I mean, it's great to see people like in Bermuda who care so deeply about the birds that they have around them, which they absolutely do. And so, I think Louise is very interested in going back, and I absolutely hope she does, because I think there's a lot of neat questions that could be asked.
When you look at our Pritzker lab, the DNA lab at the Field Museum, we've trained more than 400 people in the last 10 years from 35 countries. So those are legacies, yes, right? Just like the specimens that get put in the collections are legacies, and that those things transform the world, and those are the things that will save birds. And that takes dedication, connections, and caring about not just the earth, but about people too.
That's awesome.
All right. Well, I think that's probably a good place to stop for this episode. Anybody have anything they want to add to wrap it up?
Nope. Get out, go birding.
Thanks everyone for listening. We want to wish everyone a safe and happy 4th of July. Check out our Instagram, Birds of a Feather podcast, next week for a link when our host, John Bates, is on an episode of Ologies with Allie Ward. We'll be back with new episodes the week after the 4th. Cheers and happy 4th from John, Shannon, Amanda, and myself.